This is Brad Carmack, author of Homosexuality: A Straight BYU Student's Perspective. You're welcome to download my book for free at bradcarmack.blogspot.com. You can also purchase a hard copy by contacting me at homosexualityperspective@yahoo.com. This is the third part in a moral case for LDS same-sex marriage. We're going systematically through 26 reasons that support LDS same-sex marriage. We've completed 6 so far. We'll be starting here on reason number 7, which is settling young men. We're preceded by reason number 6 on the last clip, which talked about providing reliable caregivers. So we'll start out here again on reason number 7, settling young men. A few years ago, I was living in a singles ward in Provo, Utah, just south of BYU campus in the Moon Apartments. And when I was there, I remember having a talk at one point with my bishop, which is a one-on-one, just he and I. And he talked about the importance of marriage and helping to settle young men. He says that it's kind of a common wisdom that young men, especially in their early 20s and in their late teens, are full of energy, and they're usually fairly hypersexual. They have a lot of testosterone. They have a lot of ambition, and they're at risk for a number of risky behaviors. And that marriage has a settling effect on them, and that it provides responsibilities that anchor them to society and keeps them away from some of their more risky behaviors. There was a prominent political scientist who said about 2 decades ago, much of the history of civilization can be thought of as an effort to adapt these male dispositions to contemporary needs by restricting aggression or channeling it into appropriate channels. That adaptation has often required extraordinary measures. Of all the institutions through which men may pass, schools, factories, the military, marriage has the largest effect. And this author went on to note that the stabilizing and settling effect of marriage is unmatched by other institutions. He says unmarried men between 24 and 35 are 3 times as likely to murder another male. They're more likely to rape and rob, among other risks, than their married counterparts are. And I could give a more exhaustive review, I think, of the civilizing effects of marriage, but I think they're fairly intuitive, because being married means to be, in the eyes of society, grown up. There's a quote here that says, marriage creates stakes. Someone depends on you. Marriage creates a safe harbor for sex. Marriage puts 2 heads together, pooling experience and breaking impulsiveness. Of all the things a young person can do to move beyond the vulnerabilities of early adulthood, marriage is far and away the most fruitful. We are different people when we have a home, more stable, more productive, more mature, less self-obsessed, less impatient, less anxious, and marriage is the great domesticator. Now, notice, I think that few would contend, but homosexuals need economic and emotional stability no less than heterosexuals do. And certainly society benefits when homosexual-oriented males have economic and emotional stability. And I'd also note that it's not only marrying itself, but the very prospect of marriage that can contribute to the social benefit of settling these marinated in testosterone-brained men. I've observed this in my own life and in the lives of my peers. Said one, if you hope to get married, and if your friends and peers hope to get married, then you will socialize and date more carefully. If you're a young woman, you will avoid getting pregnant unintentionally or gaining what used to be called a reputation. If you're a young man, then you'll reach respectability. You'll devote yourself to your work, try to build status, and earn enough money to make yourself marriageable. And this is often true of women as well. People who expect to get married observe and emulate husbands and wives. So it's not just the marriage, it's also the prospect of marrying that can stabilize and settle young men. Now, a critic might say, well, so what? Young homosexual men can still get married to a woman. This is certainly a legitimate contention. But the rebuttal reminds me, I had a discussion a while ago with a friend of mine named Matthew and my brother. And one person was advocating for same-sex marriage, and then my friend Matthew pushed back and says, well, I know homosexually oriented people that are happily married to someone of the opposite sex, such as gay men married to straight women. And out of earshot of Matthew, my brother Riley retorted that a lot of black people manage to attain some level of happiness under the yoke of slavery as well, but the fact doesn't argue in favor of maintaining the institution of slavery. And there's been a number of others that have made comparisons to the treatment of black people and the treatment of gays, including in marriage. One of them says, and this is quoted from Griffin's famous book, Black Like Me, Whites told their black employees, and really believed it, that the NAACP and Martin Luther King were the black men's greatest enemies. They were offended by any suggestion of injustice. They claimed that they always treated black people wonderfully well, and always would, so long as black people stayed in their place. If you asked them what that place was, they couldn't say, but every black man knew that that place was right in the middle of the stereotype. Many in the anti-same-sex marriage can't make the same claim. We treat homosexuals wonderfully and always will, as long as they stay in their place outside marriage. Now, hopefully the comparable prejudice is only true for a small subset of same-sex marriage opponents. But there are some parallels. There was a study in 2010 that was looking at 20 years of mixed orientation marriage studies. And I'll quote from that meta-study. It said, descriptive analysis revealed that all women had participated in a lifelong monogamous marriage, even those who had some knowledge of their husband's premarital homoerotic feelings. So this is describing the sample. It's women in mixed orientation marriages. 48% of the participants had divorced, separated, or were in the process of leaving their husbands. Grief, social isolation, and feeling deceived were common responses of women after they discovered the sexual or emotional relationships of their husbands with other men. Women did not feel at liberty to seek support from friends and family due to fear of stigma. Of the 52% of participants who remained married, 3 of those 52% felt secure in their relationships, and most married couples were not sure if their marriages would endure. And we also know that the majority of marriages where the husband comes out, if the homosexual-oriented partner comes out to the heterosexual-oriented spouse, most often gay men coming out to straight wives, that if the husband didn't come out about his orientation before the marriage, but instead after the wedding, that 85% of those marriages ended in divorce within 3 years. Another study said that all participants reported depression longer than a month before coming out to their wives, and reported self-loathing after witnessing their wives' anger and pain. Men were fearful of losing friends and family ties after coming out. And I've heard similar accounts from a number of people, both that I've read about and that I've talked to directly about their experiences, especially gay men who come out to their wives. The earlier practice of the church decades ago was to prescribe heterosexual marriage as a way of curing homosexuality, as we know that succeeds in very few, if any, cases, and oftentimes in the interest of intimacy and honesty, men do come out to their wives, and often with disastrous consequences. There's another quote here about mixed orientation marriages, but I will just summarize by saying that gay men in many mixed orientation marriages fantasize about men in order to enable their sexual performance. So they're fantasizing about men when they're having sex, and oftentimes they're going to the bathroom and vomiting after they have sex with their wives. And oftentimes they just have very duplicitous lives, and they feel a lack of integrity. And some of these analyses of mixed orientation marriages go back to as early as 1897. There's a treatise that I quote in my book on sexual inversion. It talks about how people that are homosexual oriented, even though they're sleeping with someone of the opposite sex, don't lose their attractions and orientation for those of the same sex, and in fact are oftentimes, for instance, gay men. The author described it as practicing masturbation per vaginum, which means that they're just getting sexual pleasure in a way that's not natural for them, and I think that might as well apply to the opposite sex as well. I note that the trust vitiating risk of adultery, so there's a lot more risk of adultery in mixed orientation marriages compared to opposite sex couples, although of course there is a risk of adultery in both, just as there's a risk of divorce in both, but it's elevated in mixed orientation marriages on both adultery and divorce as a possible harm. Those that would say that you can sell young men that are homosexual oriented by having them marry women, I would ask those same critics, if indeed they are straight, to imagine a world where there's only same-sex marriage, where opposite-sex marriage is not an option. Opposite-sex couples have no special legal or cultural status, and if you do have an opposite-sex relationship, then you're considered to be cohabiting. So kind of turn the tables, and I would ask that critic, how willing would you be, let's say the critic is male, how willing would you be to marry another man in this world where only same-sex marriage is allowed? Of course, I don't know what the critic would say in response to this question, but this heterosexual author is exceptionally interested in marrying a woman and very intensely disinterested in marrying another man, and I doubt that those interests would be very different if the tables were turned and I lived in a culture where only same-sex marriage was appropriate. I'll quote here, "Most regard the hope of a love marriage as the sine qua non of the pursuit of happiness ahead of career, money, fame, even children." Now, if LDS same-sex marriage were available, I would make two predictions. The first is that very few heterosexuals, if any, would avail themselves of same-sex marriage, and but few homosexuals would opt for opposite-sex marriage. There was an author of a book entitled "When Gay People Get Married: What Happens When Societies Legalize Same-Sex Marriage." She was looking at the Netherlands, which has had legalized same-sex marriage since 2001. She said, and I quote, "I compare the actual rates of same-sex marriage or registered partnership across countries. What I find is that the vast majority of gay and heterosexual couples alike choose marriage when they have the options for legal recognition." So to conclude this section, again, this is reason number 7 about settling young men. By prohibiting same-sex marriage, all homosexuals except those who enter mixed orientation marriages are effectively barred from marriage, and thus, for the male subset of that population of homosexual-oriented people, from the settling and stabilizing effects of marriage. So society and homosexual-oriented individuals as part of that society have much to gain as far as the settling and stabilizing effects of marriage from the institution of same-sex marriage. Okay, so let's move on to reason number 8. In my book, this is entitled, "God Did Not Create All Men Physically Male and Female." Now, up to this point, the first 7 reasons in support of same-sex marriage have largely been the same reasons that Mormons would support opposite-sex marriage. So we're going to now transition into a few reasons that more uniquely apply and specifically apply to same-sex as compared to opposite-sex marriage. Okay, so a number of church leaders have argued against a biological origin for homosexual orientation based on the claim that God makes no mistakes. This position was most recently iterated by President Packer in his conference talk. He said, quote, "Some suppose that they were preset and cannot overcome what they feel are inborn tendencies towards the impure and the unnatural. Not so. Why would our Heavenly Father do that to anyone? Remember, He is our Father." And earlier on he had said, "While it is a convincing idea to some, it is of the devil. No one is locked into that type of life. From our premortal life we were directed into a physical body. There is no mismatching of bodies and spirits. Boys are to become men, masculine, manly men, ultimately to become husbands and fathers." Okay, so the claim here is that God created us male and female, and Genesis says this as well. But did He? I would say the answer is clearly not, if indeed you're talking about physical gender or physical sex. The idea that God made all of us either physically male or physically female falls short, not far beyond its application to Adam and Eve in the garden. And this is the reason why. The claim that God made us all physically male or physically female includes 2 requirements. One, that every individual must be placed either into the male or the female camp, and 2, that there are no false positives, meaning there are no males that are classified as females and no females that are classified as males. And so the next question is, how do you tell the difference between a man and a woman? Now, sometimes this would seem sort of a comical question, and it was mocked by President Packer in the General Conference address when a cat was brought before a child and asked the child if it was a male or a female. The child says, "We can vote on it," and that was cast as a ridiculous way to resolve the question. But indeed, somewhat ironically, that is exactly what needs to be done in some cases. It's not always clear whether an individual, whether it be a cat or a human, is a male or a female. So a lot of people say, well, just use the pull your pants down test, Look and see if they have a vagina or a penis, and then you know if they're a male or a female. Well, this test fails because there are some people that have both. There are some individuals that have neither. There are some that have a partial penis, partial clitoris. There are some that have both ovaries and testicles. Some people have testicles in place where the ovaries should be. This test violates both requirements above, meaning that not everybody is placed neatly into one of 2 categories. There are some that are kind of in both or neither. And also there could ostensibly be false positives and or false negatives, depending on what other criteria you would use. So another way to test whether you're male or female is to take a look at your genes. If you're XY, you're a male. If you're XX, you're a female. This would help because people with ambiguous genitalia, you could still test their genotype and then you would know if they're male or female. Well, this test fails as well. There are some people that are XXY. There are some people that are XXYY. There are some people that are XY, but the SRY gene isn't expressed, or it's damaged, so they look phenotypically female, even though their genotype is male. And this test won't tell a judge how to come down in these cases, which means that not everybody is clearly placed in Camp 1 or Camp 2, which again violates our requirements above, to be able to conclude that God made every individual person either a male or a female. Another test which has been proposed, you can take a look and see, does that person make sperm or eggs? It's the gametes test. Well, there's a number of people that don't make any gametes at all, meaning that oogenesis or spermatogenesis is aborted upstream, and this frustrates the first requirement because you don't know how to classify those people. Another way that's been proposed is to look at people's brains. The average male and the average female brain are demonstrably different in a number of statistically significant ways and structural ways. However, there are individuals that have intermediate brain phenotypes. So people have a male brain but female genitalia and or female genes. There are those with a phenotypically female brain and female genitalia, but they have male genes. And again, this brain test isn't conclusive because it doesn't clearly place everyone correctly into either the male or the female camp. Another test that's been proposed, is the last one we'll look at, is sexual orientation. If the person has a sexual orientation towards men, then that individual must be a woman, and vice versa. This is a pretty counterintuitive test. We think that there's a number of gay men, for instance, that are very clearly male, even though they have an orientation towards men. And also, sexual orientation is on a spectrum. It's not binary, so it's not clear how to classify bisexually oriented people based on this test. So the point is here that there really is no clear way to put every individual clearly into male or female, and thus it's difficult to conclude that God made each one of us physically, our biological sex, either male or female. One example would be Mr./Ms. Chase. She was born in New Jersey. She had ambiguous genitalia that baffled her doctors. Her parents originally named her Brian and noted that she was XX, even though nobody really understood why she had her intersex condition. She was born with mixed male and female sex organs. It was discovered later on that she had ovaries and a uterus, or he, I guess, named Brian as well. There was a clitoridectomy that was performed when she was 18 months old. They moved to a new town and raised Brian as a girl, and renamed her Bonnie. Even though she began speaking before the operation, she was silent for 6 months after the operation. She developed an ovotestis at age 8, and it was later clarified as the testicular part of her ovotestes. She found out about the clitorectomy at age 10, and by 21 she'd gained access to her medical records, or his medical records. She/he now goes by 2 names, Bo and Cheryl, and advocates that surgery should only be done on patients who are able to make an informed choice. So this is just one example of many intersex persons that violates this claim that everybody is male or female made by God. And so the question is, well, what is a bishop to do when one of these ambiguous gender person comes before him and wants to get married? Does he send him away with a prescription for celibacy? Does he randomly assign the person a gender and then restrict their marriage to the opposite sex? And oftentimes, judges have to decide the gender of these ambiguous individuals when that person is very young. Sometimes they order invasive surgery and hormone treatments to force the individual to become one gender. I've worked for a judge who told me that he's had to make the call a few times, make that judgment call. And oftentimes the intersex person will grow up and angrily claim that the judge got it wrong, and sometimes ask for a sex change operation. And in any case, these individuals go up and criticize, and some of them say that they should be allowed to be a third gender, intersex, and not have to be able to fit the black and white male or female mold that society imposes. Regardless, unless and until a reliable and unambiguous test of physical gender is identified, the existence of intersex persons frustrates the true gender claim. Now, why does this matter to this discussion about supporting same-sex marriage? Well, as we can see, the claim that God made everyone physically male or female is demonstrably false, or at least has yet to be proven true. Now, if this block is removed, and again, this isn't even going into transgender issues where individuals, some subset of transgender persons who feel that their spiritual gender doesn't match their physical gender. But if you take away this building block that God made everyone male or female, the idea that God gave everyone the proper sexual orientation is also suspect. A lot of times it's been evidenced by church statements, the idea that gay people are perverts. They have a heterosexual orientation that they've perverted into an orientation towards the same sex. It seems that that's not likely the case, at least for a large majority of homosexual-oriented people. But the point is, if the person comes to the bishop and asks for marriage, the bishop does not know with certainty the spiritual gender of the requester. Now, the Founding Proclamation says that gender is an aspect of premortal identity. Now, we didn't have our bodies premortally, so therefore the conclusion is that the gender referred to in the Founding Proclamation is spiritual and not a physical gender. Well, how does the bishop know the spiritual gender of the person in front of him? I would suggest that he doesn't know. I would say that if, for instance, let's say each of us were in a room. There are 10 bodies in this room. One has had no vital signs for an hour on heart, lungs, or brain. There's another that has brainstem function but no higher brain function. One's had no brain function but the lungs and heart are working. One has had no vital signs for 2 seconds. One has united egg and sperm. But one sperm and egg are united but the chromosomes aren't yet united. One was partway through syngamy, which is the union of the genetic material of the egg and sperm. One is 3 seconds after syngamy. One's 10 days after syngamy, and the last one is 230 days after syngamy. So there's 10 bodies in here. My question to you is, how many spirits are in the room when you walk in, including yourself? And I think that we wouldn't know. We don't know how many spirits are there. The Church Handbook of Instructions 17.2.10 says that it is a fact that a child has life before birth. However, there is no direct revelation on when the spirit enters the body. Some apostles have said at birth, some right before, some say at the union of egg and sperm. The point is that we don't know. And without being told, neither you nor I nor the bishop can tell how many ensouled bodies are in the room with their eyes closed. And they probably can't even do it with their eyes open. And so, if we can't even tell the existence or presence of spirits, how can we be expected to discern an attribute of the spirit of an individual? And I would claim that the way that we ascertain or we conclude as to the gender of an individual is by opening our eyes and looking at them. And we can be deceived by appearances. People get sex change. If they get a sex change from male to female, would we let that individual marry a man? What if the person were born intersex? There's not really a basis for affirming conclusively the spiritual gender of any person, regardless of their physical appearance. And so the bishop really has an option between marriage or non-marriage. It's not between marrying men to women and women to men. If he has somebody come before him, he either has to say, I'm not going to marry anyone together because of the risk of having 2 men or 2 women marry each other, or I'm going to marry all the couples that come before me because I don't know the spiritual gender of the individual. I just know that there's an individual there, and in the interest of having some marriages rather than none, I'm going to let them marry. That's basically the 2 options that he has. And because we can't discern spiritual gender, I would say that the foundation of marriage access should be based on a more discernible foundation. Namely, are the 2 partners, are they consenting, do they meet the minimum age requirements, those types of factors, rather than on some indiscernible spiritual gender criterion, which may be important, but if we can't discern it, then it shouldn't enter into our calculations. Okay, so that's reason number 8. That God did not create all men, male or female, at least that we can tell physically. Number 7, we talked about settling young men, and that will conclude this clip.